So this video, we're going to be talking about images, textures, and materials. This is really for the beginners out there that are just getting into 3D art and maybe a little confused by all the different terminology and just the different things that go into creating PBR materials and things like that. So sometimes I take for granted the fact that I grew up with all this. So I've seen things go from diffuse workflow to specular to PBR, and I got a better understanding of that than probably most. But the thing is that how do images actually work, right? Like some of this comes into play and explains how they work in game engines as well, a little bit. So there's a little bit like computer sciences behind this. And so we're just going to get started with just looking at a basic image. So most images in digital, at least, are RGB images, generally speaking, not all of them, but we'll talk about color spaces here in a sec. I just want you to take note of the red button here, the red stitching and the red button back there. Okay. And when you break down an image into its individual channels, you got red, green, and blue channels. If I turn on just the red channel, it doesn't change a whole lot. It looks like we just desaturated it almost. But take note, the red button is actually white now. And so that's going to happen with stitching and the other button as well. Now, if we were to go over to the green channel, you'll see that what ends up happening over here is that the whole image doesn't really change a whole lot. But the red button now is actually black. And same with the other button and the stitching. You go over to the blue channel, same deal here. It looks very similar to the last one, right? Okay, so there's little minute changes that are occurring across the different channels. And so what's really happening, if I was to turn on red and green for just a moment, you'll realize, well, it turns yellow, first of all, but the red button is actually, well, kind of red now. And the same with the other one over there. So the way digital images work is that it's mixing all of these, well, it's kind of interpolating what happens between all three of these different images. So if all three uniformly go up in value, so from black to white, right? If they go up to pure white, it'll appear white. If they all go down to black, it'll appear black. That's what's going on here in the background. Now, when two of the channels are missing something, it'll show up as red, right? And if the two mix together with grays in between, it'll turn yellow in this case for these two. But the other channel would do a different result. So if we were to go to the blue channel, you'll see we get magenta, right? If we were to switch this around one more time, we'll get cyan. And so that's just how it's building out the color spectrum here for the color wheel, and all the tones as well is playing around between these three channels. There's another little channel called an alpha channel. This is usually reserved for creating opacity or making your textures transparent. This is good for things like foliage, other little thin items you might want to have transparent textures and whatnot. So just keep that in mind. So that's just like kind of an additional channel there for transparency. All right, but when they all combo together, you can get exactly what you expect to see here, which is a fully completed image. So uh, let's go take a look at this real quick. So I also want to point out that this is an 8-bit image, right? And so an 8-bit image from black to white here is going to have about 256 stops of different shades of gray. And the kind of same thing will happen with the colors as well. And so what ends up happening here is that you can build out, um, well, it won't have 256 stops of colors total for the whole image. It gets to some absurd number. I don't remember it offhand, but if you increase the bit depth, what ends up happening is that we'll go to an even higher number. So it becomes, there's more fidelity to higher bit images, generally speaking. Right. So, but this one's much more manageable, lower in file size, all that fun stuff. So that's a good thing to remember. Now, also, because when you're working with game art, as opposed to like photography or graphic design or something like that, when you're working with game art, the game engines really want powers of two when it comes to resolution. So I think most of you can understand resolution, but basically, this image size here, if I was to go to scale to new image here, right now it's a 6,000 by 4,000 pixel image, but game engines really like to use powers of two. So it would go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and that's where those numbers come from if you've seen those before. So it would go like 32, 64, 128, 256, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people use things like 256 by 256 images, or 512s by 512s, or 1024s by 1024s, because the little square is actually easier to compute. But it doesn't mean you can't use something like a a 512 by 4096 texture, right? So just keep in mind, you want to use powers of 2, and the squares are a little bit more performant than the elongated type setups, right? The wider textures and whatnot. Uh, Now, on the other side of that, um, lower resolution means less memory use and all that fun stuff. So keep that in mind. But the main thing here is that the main thing here to remember is that it's just you want to use what you need at the time that works well with the game engine. So refer to the documentation of the game engine. Like Unity works kind of one way. They're all pretty similar, but Unity might be one way, CryEngine another, Unreal Engine another. And sometimes you have to do things called packing, where and we'll get to that a little bit later, but basically you use these channels to pack in certain textures into one single image. So let's go ahead and jump on over to properties here. And so there's something called image color space. This is also something that's pretty important. You'll see this come up quite a bit, but you can see right now, oh, the other thing I was going to mention, the alpha channel, if you don't need it, you can get rid of it usually, depending on what you're creating. Sometimes you can just get rid of it and not worry about it. Here in Krita, I guess they all have alphas, but anyways, the main thing is that's also a performance slowdown just a little bit having that fourth channel. So what we're looking at is an 8-bit image. If I was to increase this to 16-bit, we would get more dots or more stops of information, I guess. But it won't convert up. Like 8-bit going to 16-bit, it doesn't create a better image. You have to actually create it at like 16 and then bring it down to 8-bit perhaps, or create it at something higher. So there's things like raw image formats where like you take a photo with a digital camera and it's using raw format. It's completely unedited and it's extremely large file sizes. But that would allow you to usually bring it down. You can create those as 16-bit images and things like that. So just want to point that out real quick. Now you'll see here the color profile for this is sRGB LE version 2. This is just for Krita. There's a lot of different color profiles out there that exist. Some like Adobe RGB are pretty common, sRGB linear maybe. But let's take a look at the color space browser. This will make more sense here. So this little section is what the human eye can interpret. And you'll see sRGB, it kind of occupies this little space here. And so most consumer monitors, they don't even take full advantage of the whole sRGB spectrum, just so you know. Certain monitors out there, you'll see that they're Adobe RGB calibrated monitors, perhaps. Um, this happens to just use a little bit more of that color spectrum. But the human eye can still see a lot more stuff. It's actually pretty interesting. If you were to do an optical illusion, you can Google search it and look for like an optical illusion to see true cyan. You'll actually see that's a really bright cyan color that just your monitor will never replicate. And most printers can never replicate as well. So just keep that in mind. But there's a lot of different things in here. And so you might be switching color profiles or bit depths, but it's important to remember these things as you're working with images. You might be creating gray scale images of just black and white, and you might be creating color images as well that have make use of a color space profile. So that's nice, but probably won't get into that too much. At certain points, this can come into play. Certain things like normal maps like to use 16-bit images, perhaps, unless they're doing like 8-bit dithered. But also things like displacement or height maps, usually 16 bits of information, because it creates a finer gradient when it comes to the colors, the amount of colors it can represent. So if I was to just zoom in here, I'm just going to use a quick Q-tip little blender thing. We'll try to give you a quick example. Even though we're on 8-bit image, if I was to just start moving this out heavily, you see how we got these little lines that show up? Okay, this is often one of the issues you'll run into with normal maps or height maps. It's called, well, a lot of people call it stepping. All right, there's these little lines here. Okay, that's just you running out of different grays that can be represented with an 8-bit image. And so just keep that in mind. These little lines, when you create a displacement map, it's going to cause a little stepping issue. We'll go over to Blender real quick. I'll kind of represent what's going on there with a subdivided cube real quick. Get it smooth. So when you displace with displacement maps, it's literally when you're using it with mesh, anyways, it will take the vertices and it basically pushes them out from the surface. And so if you have any kind of stepping effect in there, it might do like a whole patch of pixels or a whole patch of vertices, and it'll push them out like this, and it creates like little stepping effects like this along the surface. Okay, so if you ever run into that issue, now you know what to look for. It looks a little bit different in a normal map, or like different types of displacement, like OBM displacement, stuff like that. But that's basically what's going on. If you ever had that issue, hopefully you can see it and look it up now. All right, we're going to go over to Substance Painter, and we're going to check out a sample here that comes with it, the preview sphere, and we're going to look at some just different textures on this thing. So, of course, current modern day workflow is mostly PBR workflow. It's normal maps, base color maps, all this fun stuff. But we're going to look at each one real quick just so you get a good idea of what's going on here. Uh, what we want to look at is both of them. Since we're not going to be modifying this, we'll just smaller perhaps. Okay, so the material itself, it looks reflective. It's got some cool stuff going on, but it might be a little bit confusing with how all of this is actually working and what you're looking at. So let's look at what composes this PBR material here real quick. And if we take a look, single channels, there's base color. That's what we're going to start with. And base colors, as it sounds, it's just the color. There's no lighting information in this. There's no shadows. And what you see here is supposed to represent maybe grease or dirt in the corners. And of course, it would have a slightly different color than the metal. So the base color is pretty easy to understand. Usually it's an RGB 3-channel image. Doesn't need an alpha channel really. And it's just color. That's it. So we can go through that. Height maps, we don't have one here. We're going to play around with that more in Blender. But basically, black and white image, grayscale, and it can push and pull vertices in and out of a model. So if you have enough vertices, every pixel of the height map will be able to control those vertices. Okay, so let's go to roughness. And as it sounds, roughness is controlling the complexity of the surface, like it scratches on it and little micro details. And this is going to basically, when light hits a surface, it might get shot cleanly off the surface back at a certain angle if it's super smooth and glossy. But if it's not, it's going to kind of bounce around inside of itself, perhaps, or shoot out in weird directions. And that's what roughness controls. So it's really dealing with the micro details of a surface as how light would interact with it, anyways. Okay. Now metallic here is just a nice roughness is a black and white image. It's grayscale. So now we're looking at metallic. Well, metallic's a black and white image. Where it's black, it's usually not metallic, and where it's white, it's metallic. And there's usually nothing in between. Although I'm going to show you an example here towards the end of the video of where I actually use in betweens for specific purposes. There's actually ways you can kind of tweak that. It's kind of fun, but generally you'll never do that for the most part. Okay. So black and white image is very simple. It controls whether something's metal or not, or dielectric or not. You'll see that term a bit as well. Normal maps. There's nothing here as far as normal maps go. So what I'm going to do real quick is just go ahead and create a new paint layer. Turn all of these off except normal. Go to my normals I have down here. Talk about these guys real quick. So normals are actually kind of an optical illusion. It's a shader trick. And so trying to make the brush bigger so we can see it better. And we'll take a look at it with the material on in just a second. So we got this little decal or this little normal stamp I just put on. So yeah, they create an optical illusion to simulate depth. And how they're doing this is really clever, and they're a little bit confusing to look at first. But usually these are RGB images and they're 16-bit, and occasionally they can be 8-bit, depending on the game engine. But you'll see that this is kind of the result that you get. It fakes the illusion of depth on the surface of the PBR material. It's really cool and it's nice to look at. But when you're looking at it this way, it looks pretty complicated and like it's a lot of stuff to deal with, maybe. You can actually hand paint these things if you're clever enough with it. But we're going to go to Blender and play around with this idea. But the thing is that if you look here at the top of it, right, get kind of this like greenish color up here. It's more of a cyan actually, because the bottom's kind of doing it too. But this is representing what the normal's doing. So when you think of a model like this, and you're in edit mode here in Blender, you'll see that you can actually turn on different kinds of normals. Those are vertex normals, okay? And these are split normals, which control the shading. You have face normals, okay? And so what we're gonna do is play with the vertex normals here, not none of the other ones right now. And this is what's gonna control the shading. But if you were to consider every one of these vertices a pixel in an image, right? That's what's going on over on Substance Painter or in the normal map. So every pixel is acting like a normal where it has a little directional thing on it, right? And so these are pointing up and these are pointing down and these are pointing to the right and these are pointing to the left. And the clever little ways that this blends from one side to the other, all the little gradients it creates, is just everything in between with the different normals it's going to use. So the shader, creates the illusion of depth by just affecting the normals of the model or normals as light interacts with it on the surface of the texture with the shader and all that fun stuff, right? So we can create that same kind of illusion right here inside of Blender. I'm going to need more. I'm going to need more polygons for this stuff. So let me go ahead and subdivide it one more time, and we might get away with that. And you can see when it comes to actual geometry with vertices compared to using pixels, I think pixels obviously wins. There's a lot more of them, but we can create that same illusion because these things you can modify in Blender. And so what we're going to do is we're going to shrink them a little bit real quick because they're a little bit too large still, in my opinion. Right. And so if you ever take a note and you hit Alt N in Blender, there is a little menu you normally would flip your normals or recalculate inside outside. But one of those happens to be rotate. And probably most of you, if you've been playing around in Blender for a little while, you can click rotate and nothing happens. That's because you don't have these displayed, but you can actually rotate them. So if we kind of line up the best we can, hit Alt N, we click rotate, and we start moving these ones, let's say up. Right? See how we can do that? So we're moving them up, and then we can do this one below it. You can hit Alt N and rotate them, say down a little bit. Okay. And if we take a look at this model now from back here, you see what it's doing? There's nothing fancy going on here. It's just the normals are pulling light from different directions, kind of the direction they're seeking the light. It's so that's what's going on with the normal maps here. Same idea. It does exactly the same thing, except it's a material on the pixel instead of a physical model. So or model with vertices anyways. So and that's what sells that illusion right there. It works out extremely well. Pretty cool little effect. And that came about, I think the first game I've seen that show up in was Far Cry in 2005-ish, 2006-ish, something like that. It's been a while they've been around. But anyways, let's go to the next one. Anisotropic angle. This one's fun. So sometimes metal surfaces and other surfaces will kind of, when light hits it, it kind of sends it off in certain directions. Not necessarily like it just bounces off freely in all kinds of different directions. Anisotropic angle kind of controls that, and so sometimes it might try to send it out in little spiral patterns and things like that. But also it might just do little clumps of reflections off in certain directions. That's all anisotropic angle is actually doing. So this is a fun one to play around with. There's also anisotropic level, which kind of controls the amount that occurs. So it's just a little um, image that goes along with it to help create that effect. So black and white images, nothing special there. Now we're looking at mesh maps. These are baked usually from the high poly model to the low poly. You might see this quite a bit because what the way most people work now, doing a lot of high poly to low poly bakes. But you can see it just adds additional normals from a high poly model to a low poly model. So nothing real fancy here, and but it's just a normal map. Now some of these ones are a little more interesting. These are kind of like constructive textures that you might use. So like world space normal, for example. This just represents how this model sits in world space, like in the 3D world. And this is good for maybe growing like moss on top of surfaces, and you can use this for different constructive purposes, basically, is what it's coming down to. ID map, color ID, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, the easiest way to remember this, and oh, let's just do a quick little thing here in Krita, since we're at it. Um, So color ID map could be something like this. And when you're painting a wall, you get some tape out and you're like, yeah, I made a little tape thing across the middle of the wall and you paint, the bottom half. You end up with a line all the way across the middle of the wall, right? So that's masking in general. That's why it's called masking tape usually. But in digital, masking looks a little bit different, but it's relatively the same idea. And it's just you can make use of it in different ways. So if we had, like a green little line through here or something, right? When we use this little magic wand selector thing here, and I click in here, you'll see we can make selections this way. Okay. So very quick and easy to make selections. Well, this happens on 3D models as well. You can give them different materials to have different colors, and you could create masks from them relatively fast. So called a color ID mask. A little bit misleading in substance right off the bat. Color ID mask is what that is, and it's something you can put to use. Now, on the flip side of that, let's go back to Krita just one moment. I want to talk about masks in general because I think we just went over the idea of, mask in the real world, and now we got color ID masks. Let's talk about regular masks. So if we had some kind of image we're working on, we could even do this on the other image, right? Maybe. Let's see. If I turn it off, does it turn clear? Yeah, it does. Okay, so this one, for example, if I add a transparency mask to it. This happens in Photoshop and most programs. You can add transparency mask or masks. And so this is just a black and white image. It's no different than this stuff really. Where it's white, it's solid, and it's kind of the same behavior as an alpha channel in general. So where it's white, it's solid, and where it's black, it's transparent. So if I use black here real quick, start coloring on this mask, you'll see it starts turning transparent. It's not really erasing it because if I was to go back and start coloring it white, it does this number. Okay. And so just be aware of the term mask. You'll see it a lot. Mask is used in sculpting, it's used in substance, it's used in digital, it's everywhere. So and then color ID mask is just kind of an extension of that. And so, all right, let's go to substance one more time. All right, so the rest of these get kind of fun. We got ambient occlusion. So you could consider this like bounce lighting. Basically, where light doesn't get into the crevices as much, that's kind of where the ambient occlusion is created. So shadows in the corners and the crevices can be used to, throw dust in there or dirt if you're using procedural texturing tools, which is nice. Or if you want to set up a material that's procedural, even inside a Blender, you'll notice that you can use ambient occlusion over there as well for things like that. So it's just a black and white image. Color ID mask, of course, is just an RGB image. Moving on to curvature, another black and white image here. And this one, it just marks the edges for the most part. The convex edges, which are kind of like the ones that stick out like this, and the concave edges, which are just kind of in this inside here, crevices areas. So just keep that in mind. Also useful for just throwing like edge wear onto a model, things like that. Position map, this is just like the other one, but it doesn't respect the geometry itself where the faces are pointing. It's just about the overall position in the world. Okay. There's also a thickness map, which could be quite useful, and it just kind of shows you what's thicker and what's not. So these little edges here are a little bit thinner, and so that's what's going on there. And once again, you can use that for all different kinds of purposes when it comes to create materials. So these are really like, at least here in Substance, they're kind of like constructor materials. Now, you could do like a high poly to low poly bake and then just use that for a model. You don't necessarily have to start creating more stuff on top of it. Like you can see, like I painted this one in here. Um, so you don't have to always do that. It's just, if you get the quality you need out of a baked mesh map, you can just use it for whatever the purposes are, such as like the ambient occlusion or the normal map there, right? Just keep that in mind. You can do baking in Blender and not have to worry about having to mix a bunch of stuff together, perhaps in the center. So let's go ahead and go back to material preview. So all combo together, you can see it has a pretty interesting effect. You can see how it's trying to shoot that light out, kind of certain angles and directions, right? What's going on there. But anyways, let's remove all this real quick. We want to check out one more thing. It's a little bit of a pain to set up here, but on an older version of Substance, newer ones might be easier. But something's called subsurface scattering. This one's worth checking out as well. Set the skin right now. It's turned on for the most part, except I got to enable it over here as well. So we're going to go down to activate subsurface scattering. We can turn that up and down if needed. It's still not taking effect. That's because we have to create, guessed it, a channel, which is called scattering. And now you'll notice there's also one called transmissive and also emissive. We'll go over those real quick as well. So let's turn on scattering. I think emissive was already on. Maybe, no, it's not. Let's turn on emissive again. And we can turn on, we won't do transmissive, but it's very similar to subsurface scattering. So, all right, now it should be on, but we still don't see it because I need to do a fill layer, right? And so when we do a fill layer, and we'll leave scattering on, okay, crank it up, you'll see it starts to do this number. So scattering is more or less like the surface is not fully solid, and light is able to enter the surface and kind of bounce around inside the surface. So you could think of like, organic stuff, like people that, like their ears glow when the sun's behind it and all that fun stuff. That's kind of what's going on. But this happens with other things too, like candles, candle wax. Um, it lets a little bit of light enter into it. Any number of things can do this. So just pay particular attention to that. It's pretty expensive for games, but when you're doing just beauty shots and renders, this is something you may want to play around with quite a bit. And transmissive is also very similar. So think of like leaves when the sun's behind it. They light up, they get really bright. Um, that's what transmissive does. It's very similar to scattering, but it'd be for foliage and whatever else you can find use for that. Things that are mostly transparent, perhaps, are very thin. So that's pretty much everything here in Substance for now. What we can do is go take a look at some of those things in Blender, perhaps. I was talking about, see some examples. So let's do a color ID map first, and that's going to be, if I can find the model. Actually, we'll start with the OG A3, or I have a bad habit of doing that. The AUG is what it should be called, but the AUG here, we're going to take a look at. This is a diffuse model. Okay, so there is no PBR materials here going on. PBR materials is what we're just looking at with the metallic roughness and all that fun stuff. But this is just pure diffuse texture work. And this is something that a lot of Blender artists use to this day. You'll see that they'll take a diffuse texture workflow and kind of modify it where they start creating bump maps and things for a diffuse texture. And it actually renders out pretty well. Someone was asking me, like, how did some of the Half-Life 2 stuff look so good? Even though it's really old and this was made quite a while ago. And the reason is because of their lighting system. They were using bump maps on it, from my understanding, and the lighting system in the environments was actually casting light onto those bump maps and then re-rendering or pre-baking all those lights or those shadows on those textures. Um, but you'd have to have a bump map to do that. Diffuse workflow usually could be used in combo with a bump map. This was happening all the way back as early as like probably 2000 or earlier. The reason for that is just simply it wasn't something you could do real time in games, or you could even pre-bake in games at the time, but it was something you could do on 3D models and things like 3D Studio Max, right? So it's existed for some time now, but it's nothing new, and that's why a lot of those older games, even though some of the resolutions might be pretty low, but the games that received extra attention to the textures, they still kind of live up to today's standards because they're just really interesting ways of utilizing 3D software, right? And not much has changed from that other than we have more maps that we can work with potentially. But you can see, yeah, it's diffuse texture workflow. This is as simple as it gets. It's literally an image, okay? But a diffuse texture generally means that it's not directly lit. It's just kind of like an ambient lighting on it. There's no any one thing in particular. You can just see like there's a little bit of lighting on it, but it's not like harsh lighting from like the sun, where there's like a bunch of shadow, like deep, deep shadows at the bottom here. But even older games, you could take a model like this, do all this texture work from photographs. You'll do a lot of image editing, and then you could, at the last minute, take a render of your model with a skylight or whatever, and you could render ambient occlusion kind of into the 3D model itself, and it added just a nice little effect to it. And that's what I've done on this one. And so it just looks not quite like a photograph, but it does still kind of hold up, even though it's only a single image, not a PBR material. And so it might still be good for some like mobile games, low end cell phone games, things like that, or just a stylistic choice, even perhaps. But people do use diffuse workflow still. So just keep that in mind. That's what that is. So we'll try to find the color ID map now if I can. I gotta go browsing through all my stuff. Okay, it should be here. And see the thumbnails. Okay, not that one. So this is a pull lift chair, right? That I just did. It was for an ArcViz, or someone was doing an ArcViz project. I just helped them out on it real quick. But color ID map here, like these are just it's a model first of all, and it's just got colors assigned to it with the materials. This is so I could take it in a Substance Painter and kind of create masks from these colors super fast. So color ID mask, right? And all in all, it allows me to break it up by material type, right? You'll notice that I'm actually naming these, not just giving them colors. So this is, of course, what I use as the high poly to bake to what was supposed to be the low poly, but I just baked it to itself basically. So you can bake a model to itself if you need to add additional information. In this case, color ID. So um, you can see they're named that though. There's certain metals that were color themes that I might have wanted to use or whatever the case. There's all kinds of stuff going on. We'll take a look at that model without the color ID just so you get a better idea of how that material work went. This is not meant for games, so it's um, still this is not an efficient packing for games at least, but it does work for rendering purposes. So it's a little bit faster, but and you can see here the texture work is a 4096, but a 4096 even with this much surface area still tend to work out pretty well. It's not too bad. Pretty detailed, and considering this thing's gonna be viewed from, like, way back here, it's not a big deal. It's really, really quite simple. So, let's go take a look at the other one. We'll talk about packing here after this. Let's go up to let's see. Okay, so this little lure I did some time ago, turn on the materials for it. You're gonna see that well, first of all, it's, it's really glossy, but the hook's got a little bit of rusting going on, and but there's this kind of metal foil right here in the middle of it. And so this thing's clear plastic in this area, and the metal foil is actually underneath the surface. So I was talking about with the whether things are metal or they're not. This is one of the rare situations where you can actually blend a metal and have a gray kind of setting there for it. So you'll see what I'm talking about. If we go over to texture for it and we look at the metallic map, it's actually yeah, it's blending into grays on these little areas like this. And this is what just helps sell that illusion that it's actually, it's something a little bit more underneath it, perhaps. Okay. It's not real clear that it's doing that, but it's good enough from back here. You would never know the difference, really. Right. And so paying particular attention to things like that could go a long way. We go over to the shading tab. This is kind of set up traditionally. Okay. So a lot of times in programs, you're going to have a base color map, a metallic map, a roughness map, and a normal map. And you'll plug them in something like this. You'll notice that these little gray circles means they're gray images. And if they're yellow, they are colored images. And if they're purplish like this, it needs to be some kind of normal data for the most part. Or you can use perhaps bump maps as well. So you can't, like, you'll see that when you're using normal maps, you use a normal map vector here. But there's also vectors for um, bump. And so you can feed in gray images to this. It'll create a bump map. Okay, so that's something that's been around for a while. It's just a black and white image for the most part. This is really simple and easy to do. But I wanted to point this out that this is usually kind of your typical setup for image textures, anyways, PBR materials, because it's really quite simple with just an image for what you need and how you want to use it. Now, if we go back to let's go back to let's go to my map ball. Actually, I think I have it set up this way. Let's do miscellaneous and map ball. There we go. Okay, so this one right here, we go to shading. This is using Unreal Engine style um, material or textures. So if we look at it, you'll see that we have the base color, occlusion, roughness, metallic map. So a bunch of things are packed together. And if we look at emissive here, there's nothing. And a normal, that's DirectX. So Blender uses an OpenGL normal, right? But a DirectX normal, what's the difference here? Well, it's only the green channel. So just keep in mind, just like this little green channel here. Now, Krita, you can't really modify these, but all it is that this green channel is inverted. So instead of it being this way, it would literally like be the equivalent of pressing Control I, and it's inverted. Okay. Well, maybe it does do it. I don't know. Pressing Control I here. That's all that does on that channel. It'll look something like this if I desaturate this real quick. It's inverting the channel. Okay. So it's you can do that in Blender, and that's what this RGB curves is doing. So normally it's set something like this, and so when you set something like that, although it didn't seem to make much of a difference here, did it? Usually this will start looking really bad. I guess because it's so rough, it doesn't really matter. But you can see there might be a little bit of like weird faceting going on, just kind of weirdness going on. When you use a DirectX normal in Blender, it needs an OpenGL. So just create this RGB curves node. It's under Shift A, color, RGB curves, and you can swap those around so it flips them basically, and then you'll have a better setup for your material there. But what is the packing part of this? Let's go over to editor. Why not? Select everything for just a moment. Occlusion, roughness, metallic maps. Okay, so this is kind of what it looks like at the end of it, but it's a packed texture, meaning that the red channel here looks like this, the green channel looks like this, blue channel looks like that. And that's because most of the textures here are grayscale, right? So they only need a single channel. When you pack them together, you can fit a bunch of them together in one single texture. So you can do occlusion, roughness, metallic. This is just a performance optimization trick. It uses much less memory this way, and it'll help out the game's performance. And even here in Blender, if you do this, it actually helps out with your ability to render things, because if you're saving memory, you can, of course, add more stuff to your scene, perhaps, right? And so that's just kind of the way you can do that. Now, Substance Painter will let you set these up on export textures. Okay, you can see here um, we can set up output templates, and it already has a bunch of presets for stuff like this. So the Unreal Engine or pack template, you'll see I renamed some things, but it's already packing, and this is going to be the ambient occlusion. When it says mixed AO, converted maps, that's kind of what's going on over here. Sometimes it's all the ambient occlusion combined together from the model there, and this is going to be the roughness of the model, and this is metallic here, right? So this is going to be base color. Now we got alpha is opacity. And so you can actually create these things. So if you need just an RGB, an RGBA, or RGB, R plus G plus B, can you see what's going on there? RGBA or grayscale. You can create gray RGB. And you can take things you want. So maybe you just need scattering and grayscale from gray channel, and you can see, bam, we can set up another output and give it a name, set up what its priorities are. And take note, you have 8-bit dithering, 16-bit. You could change it to a JPEG, PNG, or whatever else you might want to do. Just a side note, PNGs are usually lossless, and TIFF files can store layers, and Photoshop files or PSDs can store layers as well. Um, so JPEGs are lossy, meaning that you're going to lose information as you compress the image. I'm not going to get into all that, but JPEGs are pretty wild how they actually compress. They just toss out a bunch of what looks like useless information, and but you do get some artifacts from that for some reason. So just keep that in mind. There's also WebP that's been added, which is interesting. So all right, so yeah, that's a lot of the texture stuff in a nutshell. I mean, hopefully it helps you out a little bit so that you can kind of understand how this all is acting and behaving. I'm sure there's plenty of things I forgot to mention or didn't cover. Um, Generally speaking, well, I guess we could go to maybe like Affinity Designer. When it comes to just pure images, anyways, or texture work, sometimes there's two different types of like base textures, at least texture types. There's raster graphics and then there's vector graphics. So if you're ever creating things like logos, I just want to mention this. A lot of you are probably used to working with pixels and things like that, but vector graphics are mathematical calculations for the shapes and everything, and then it fills it with pixels after the fact. So there, it's more like a procedural way of working. It's a much more forgiving way of working, anyways, than using raster graphics. But it's literally for graphic design usually, and that's just going to give you the ability to make certain things a little bit more efficiently and fast. So when you think you're just going to work in Photoshop all the time, although Photoshop does do some vector stuff, you may want to pick up another program like Inkscape, Affinity Designer, or Photoshop, or excuse me, Adobe Illustrator, and I also have some vector on hand if you need it because it can be quite useful. Okay, there's other programs out there, of course, you can also take advantage of. So don't get caught up in the mindset that you just do everything with raster, which is what goes on mostly here in Krita, and it's mostly just down to the pixel, right? So I kind of skipped the whole idea of a pixel, anyways. I think, but kind of saw a little bit of it when it was banding, at least, right? And so if you just don't know these little dots of information are the pixels, that's it. So we're gonna do some little stuff in here. You can see each little variation, or each little dot. That's the pixel, right? So your textures are able to do a lot of heavy lifting in every little pixel. These are used on what's called fragment shaders. And so when you're creating a new project in Substance, you see that you have two different options here: compute tangent space per fragment. If you don't use that, I believe it uses vertex fragments or something. Anyways, that's kind of getting into another topic that I haven't even really looked into a whole lot, but that's just the idea that this will happen in Fur. So you need to think about just like your different settings you have to go through here. I know it's a lot to take in. It's confusing. It seems a little bit overwhelming at first, but generally speaking, once you get those basics out of the way, it's not too hard. So anytime you look at something occurring in a texture and a material, and you're like, how did they do this certain specific thing, and then et cetera, like how do they achieve these kind of results? Usually, it's because they're using PBR materials. Generally speaking, um, unless they're doing some other fancy shader tricks with material in the background here where they're using like procedural stuff. So I was going to talk about displacement. I realized I just didn't get to that. So go ahead and do that. Let's do that real quick. So when we set up this model here, at least in the viewport, we add a displacement modifier. We'll see that it just expands. What we're going to do is go to the modifier, create new, go down here, and we're going to create a clouds texture. And you see it just goes crazy. So you have some controls here, mid-level, depending on how you set up your displacement map. Your mid-level might be something like a medium gray, and then you might be able to work displacement out and in at the same time. That's a possibility. But a lot of times you might start with 0 or whatever. You can tweak this and adjust it in combination with the strength. So you can click and drag and hold shift. You can see you can displace this mesh. And all this thing is a black and white image. This is literally all it is, right? It's a cloudy effect right now. And so this is a procedural texture. So Substance Designer also works this way. When you get really confused about how certain programs work, um, I know it's a lot to take in. It's overbearing sometimes, overwhelming or whatever. If I create a substance graph over here real quick that's empty. The idea is that it's creating textures kind of the same way Blender does here with these. These are procedural textures. You can make tweaks and adjustments to all kinds of things, come up with different results. You can switch from clouds to other things like noise, perhaps, right? Or whatever the case would. And so you go through these, you can make adjustments, tweaks, change the algorithms, change the settings, get all kinds of cool results. And then you could do things such as like blending procedurals, textures together on top of other textures, and it just gets crazy. And that's what happens inside Substance Designer too. So if you ever watched one of these tutorials from anybody, it seems like a lot of maniacal stuff is going on. It's a combination of non-destructive procedural textures but also kind of how you would work in Krita. You know, when you're creating an image, you're like, well, I'm going to create a new layer of something, right? Like here's green, here's some, we're going to do a new layer of like some yellow on top of it. And then you could change blending modes. So you'll have like blends of multiply, overlay, and all kinds of fun stuff in here. So these are literally just taking those values, the 0 through 255 values on the 8-bit images at least, and it's doing different things there. Like it might each pixel might have like a 0 or a 255 value, but you can do things like addition and add those numbers together, and you can see how that works out. So that's what it's doing is it's comboing all that stuff together with addition. It's doing multiplication between the two values between each pixel, and or you could do like overlay, and I don't even remember what that one does, but these are the kind of results and the effects you get out of it. Okay, but every time you create this kind of deal here in Krita, and you go ahead and you start painting something else, and you're like, I want to blend this one too, and so you get in this habit of doing this. You might do like some lighting on one, some shadows on the other, and then you might do coloring on another layer on top of a black and white image. You have multiple layers getting stacked up and all those things like that, right? So, Substance Designer is more or less the same thing, except you're using procedural nodes, basically. So, wanted to point that out. So you can see here we have clouds and grunges and stuff, just like Blender. Same idea. You drop it in, but I want to blend this one with another one. So here I'm going to blend, right? And so now I take another one over here and I'm going to plug it in to there. This is the exact same idea of having these stacked up on top of each other. So we're going to blend them just like we were in Krita here. Oh, I keep clicking the wrong thing. There we go. And we can blend with, well, multiply, for example, right? Or overlay, all kinds of fun stuff. If I double click this, we can actually see the results. So divide, multiply. I can mouse wheel through these as well. Yeah, so we can create blending effects basically, but these are procedural materials, so we can actually change the scale, right? Or we can change the disorder and things like that. So exactly the same deal as this over here. And so Blender, it doesn't have maybe as many procedural options, but they're very customizable too. So just keep that in mind if you want to play around with this idea here. You certainly can do that. So all in all, this will go kind of the same route with everything that you would do, usually kind of manually, where you add a layer and you add a layer and you mix and you add a layer. Okay, so it's just happening over here with these little nodes, and that's why these materials sometimes look really crazy when you watch videos. They look like they get stuck with like a huge, crazy web spider thing that creates a material. It's just that when you do a lot of work for a material, you get a lot of nodes. So it's not as scary as you think. And then eventually these all get outputted anyways. So if we were to use like the base material output, this is probably the last thing I'm going to talk about. There's different types of PBR materials in general. So just keep that in mind that some PBR, well, there's different kind of terminology with it. There's PBR metallic rough, there's PBR metallic smoothness, there's PBR specular gloss. Okay. And so they all act and behave just slightly different from one another. You'll actually notice that in Substance Painter, at least when we export textures, all some of these presets already are set up for stuff like that. So this makes life a lot easier, generally speaking. You'll see that we have Unity's HDR render pipeline uses metallic standard or metallic smoothness, basically. And so the Unity HD render pipeline specular glossiness is also in here as well. I believe that's specular glossiness. The Unreal Engine 4 Pact is in here. CryEngines, which is using spec gloss, I think, is in here. Actually, let's take a look. Just click on it. We can see this is using diffuse, opacity, and specularity, normal DirectX, and glossiness. There you go, specular gloss. So I didn't get into specularity. It's basically how much light is bounced off of a surface, like if it's a lot or it's a little. Um, you can tweak those values. Usually, it doesn't change a whole lot between different materials, but sometimes it can. So it's kind of important. And specular reflections can also change colors depending on what it's hitting or bouncing off of, but it's kind of rare that it does that as well. So there is, if you take note in Blender shaders, you are the principal BSDF shader. Um, it doesn't have specular color in here, but some shaders or some game engines will. But that's because when, like, say you have like oil slick or something like that, you get like those rainbow colors, light bounces off of it. Um, things like that can actually occur in real life, and if you don't have that option available, it's kind of hard to do. So I don't know exactly how Blenders works. I haven't really tried it here, but um, anyways, with that out of the way, I feel like I'm missing something I wanted to talk about. I know it's probably one more thing I want to say. Oh yeah. So not only are there different kind of PBR workflows, they're not completely interchangeable either within certain software. You have to be careful with this one. Let's go back to Designer. So for example, in Substance Painter here, let's get rid of actually, yeah, we'll go to Painter, do this. I want to take a material and just say use brass. I think this one will do it. We'll see. Might not actually. Let's do something a little bit more complicated. Do a smart material. I'm pretty sure some of these will suffer and they won't actually work out. We'll use this smart material real quick. All right. And here we can see that if we were to change the shader, for example, and we went to this is PBR Metal Rough, which is what Blender uses, by the way. But if we try to go to non-PBR spec glossiness, it would definitely break. Let's find a different one. Most of these are PBR Metal Rough, but is it the first one? Mm, I thought I had a different shader in here. So we'll do non PBR. You see, it's just like for the most part, it's broken this model by switching the shader. So sometimes you can't get away with stuff like that. You got to be careful, but you might not want to switch the shaders around. All right. And even if you were to try to change something over here, I feel like I'm missing a button. No. Okay. Yeah. So if you change that shader there, that's going to break it. But if you were to try to export, for example, usually exports work okay, fine, but it depends on the material as well. Like if the material isn't supported, you're going to get bad results out probably. So you have to be careful of that. Material needs to work both ways. Some of the older ones didn't actually work both ways, as far as I can tell. But let's try it real quick. Let's do export texture. We'll do output. Something not packed together, preferably, but we'll do PBR specular gloss. Oh, you can see it actually has presets for it, converted from metallic rough, right? This used to not exist, I think, for a little while. But anyways, so yeah, you can't convert it from metallic rough, which I've actually set up some nodes in Designer to help do that. There's one that you could utilize to create both, but you'll see what's happening here in a second. So this thing was a pain to set up, but there's a base color node that comes with Substance Designer. Okay. And so this will let you kind of plug in different things that you want. And then on top of that, you can switch between PBR metallic rough and specular glossiness over here. Just kind of interesting. It's kind of good. Um, but there's a lot of other maps that I really wanted out of that thing. And so I went ahead and made my own node that's similar to that. And I put this up on Gumroad. So if you have Designer, go grab this thing. It's going to help out a little bit, hopefully, and help you find any bugs in it because I think it sometimes get buggy. But I'm going to open the reference on it real quick. I just want to show you what's going on here in this thing because I have to go through the process of loading in a PBR metallic rough. It's what it's meant to do is load in PBR metallic rough because I work in Blender a lot, and then it switches it over to whatever else I might need it to be for the most part. It doesn't do everything, but um, most of the software I work with anyway. So you can see it's bringing in different maps, ambient occlusion or roughness, and it's kind of distributing them out and sending them off in different directions over here to the right to do different things. So some of these I'm doing like alpha merges, creating alpha channels, all that fun stuff. Here you can see you got the regular occlusion doesn't actually really do a whole lot, but it does get used to create a occlusion roughness metallic map for Unreal Engine by default because I use that in Blender quite a bit as well because it just saves memory. But uh, on top of that, we can convert from this is a node that Adobe came up with, Substance, and you can see this converts PBR metallic rough to PBR spec gloss or spec gloss in general. So all kinds of stuff going on in here, and I only take advantage of a little bit of it, but you get the idea, right? Like this is kind of how crazy little processes take place. None of this is actually that complicated. It's just the process of doing, right? Like I want to take a normal map and either I want to bring in a normal map texture or just use a regular normal map color. I can switch between the two now. And then I can split this off in different directions to do different things. In this case, when it goes down, I'm just converting the green channel here or inverting the green channel. See, invert green channel. So I'm turning a DirectX normal map into an OpenGL one, right? Simple enough. So when you see these things, don't get overwhelmed by them. Um, this is how most digital software now is working, where it's input. Well, that's kind of a programming thing, right? Where it's like input and then output, and then somewhere in the middle is all of the program basically, where calculations take place, the algorithm, right? And so now you're doing inputs, outputs with materials, textures, animations, all kinds of fun stuff like that. And so that's where GeoNodes comes into play with all this. If you're still new to the idea of GeoNodes, input, output, right? And then your math calculations or algorithm exists here in the middle, generally speaking. So, with that in mind, hopefully this is kind of a good little crash course for you that there's all kinds of different things you can do. The terminology doesn't, it's not really as crazy as you probably think. Like, yeah, it seems like a lot at first. But once you get in the mindset, like it's input, outputs, it's just RGB colors, RGB alphas, black and whites, different bit depths. I mean, it really doesn't get too much crazier than that. There, of course, there are some like special cases with different formats of textures, like DDS formats you probably haven't heard of or haven't seen. Maybe certain game engines use that. A lot of them used to use it, and then less of them today, I think. But I don't know. Maybe they're used more than I think or know about. But yeah, and then there's a bunch of like back end stuff that could be happening with different programs. So things that aren't so readily apparent. And then as an artist, at least if you're just trying to get into doing 3D art, 2D art digitally, it's really you only need to know so much of this really, like down to the T, like bit depth perhaps, color space, color, like and after beyond that, like how to pack a texture and like what are the different textures? Like are they grayscale or color? And once you get past that, I think you'll be pretty good. That's what this video was about. Is really just for you guys to kind of learn a little bit about that and get a little bit of a deep dive on it. Or I wouldn't say it was a deep dive, but a little bit of a dive into it and see how it all works out. So hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I will check you out in the next one. All right. Take care.